Hollywood has always been reluctant to take a chance on an original IP. Movies cost a lot of money, and the surer the bet, the better the chances of a film being made. That led early Hollywood to rely on pre-existing books and stage plays for source material. 1932's Tarzan the Ape Man was based on a novel, and came after a string of adaptations of the same book during the silent era. 1931's Dracula was based on the stage play based on the novel. When Walt Disney wanted to expand into feature animated films, he went to the Brothers Grimm. So it was a hard pill for RKO Pictures to swallow when their executive Merian C. Cooper came to them with an idea for a wholly original IP about a giant ape fighting dinosaurs on a far-flung tropical island. Cooper reached a compromise. He would hire the famous writer Edgar Wallace to pen a novelization to be published on my birthday, December 27th, about 3 months before the film would be released on March 2nd, 1933, to prime the movie-going public and build an audience for his picture. Wallace was a celebrated British author who had moved to Hollywood in 1931 to act as a script doctor for RKO. It was through that Cooper enlisted him to draft the novelization of King Kong. Unfortunately, Wallace passed away very suddenly in 1932 from diabetes, leaving a virtually unpublishable draft of the story in his wake. Fixing it up to something workable fell to Delos H. Lovelace, who had more than a few short story credits to his name by 1932. The result is a fascinating glimpse into a nascent version of King Kong that is familiar to the 1933 film in its broad strokes, but very different in more than a few details. Some of these details are better in the novel than in the film, and others are better in the film. It's interesting to compare the two, especially considering that the novelization forms the current basis for any unlicensed King Kong work. Some of the differences are pretty basic stuff. The tramp steamer belonging to Captain Englehorn is the Wanderer in the novel, and the Venture in the film. Englehorn himself is described as more definitely ethnic Northern European in the novel, which was carried over into the thick accent he wore in Rankin Bass's The King Kong Show cartoon. We also get more characterization for the Wanderer's crew. The aged deckhand Lumpy in the novel was replaced by the Chinese cook Charlie in the film, only to be replaced back for the 2005 version, along with the junior deckhand Jimmy. The monkey is there, with his full name of Ignatz in the novel. Aboard the ship, we get more time for Anne and Jack to develop their relationship, during which they share their histories with each other, and by proxy, the reader. We find out that Jack was set to go to college but ran off to sea, which strained his relationship with his mother, who eventually forgave him. For Anne, her life in some respects mirrored the life of Fay Ray. Both Anne and Fay grew up on a ranch. Fay's mother had a nervous breakdown, after which the family moved to Arizona, then got divorced, then Hollywood. Anne, on the other hand, lost both of her parents and an inheritance, leading her to New York. The novel also had a much better, more romantic scene when Jack confesses his love for her, up in the crow's nest of the Wanderer. In the film, we get a much more abbreviated scene, with an abbreviated version of Jack's confession that he's afraid for Anne, and afraid of her too. This is a scene that I think would have actually added to the film had it been included. This, and maybe a montage or at least an additional scene of Jack and Anne talking, would have helped to flesh out the romance a bit more, beyond it being a nubile male and nubile female sharing the screen at the same time. After interrupting the ceremony, Denham's crew return to the ship and begin to speculate on what Kong is. They piece together that Kong must be some kind of gorilla from the costume of the dancers in the ceremony, and that he must be of a tremendous size because it took a dozen dancers to represent him. They also figure out that the girl in the ceremony was to be a human sacrifice. The gong at the top of the wall was a dinner bell. It's Anne who lights onto the idea that any such monstrous man-eating beast must be from a prehistoric age. As interesting as they are, the absence of these discussions doesn't really hurt the film, as they aren't really necessary. Film is a visual medium, where you're supposed to show rather than tell, and keep the descriptive dialogue down to a minimum. When they finally arrive on what the novel unwieldily calls Skull Mountain Island, we get a somewhat different vista of the village and the wall. The latter was built primarily of gargantuan logs. Only the gate was hinged to stone pillars. Between the thatch huts of the villagers were interspersed stone pillars and broken walls of great antiquity. There are only the slightest hints of these in the finished film. Adjacent to the wall are smooth stone pillars that are barely noticeable behind the more colorful and textured thatch huts and native ceremonies. It's likely a holdover from the wall's own origin, as part of the sets for Cecil B. DeMille's religious epic King of Kings. From the temple in Jerusalem, to a wall in Skull Island, to a part of Atlanta collapsed in flames during the Civil War. In the novel, we don't actually see Anne get kidnapped. It is as much a surprise to the reader as it is to the crew of the Wanderer. Instead, we catch up with Anne in the following chapter, and from there, the differences between the novel and the film really come into sharp focus. Compared to the novel, the film is very streamlined. Another interesting quirk is that Lovelace lacks much descriptive prowess when it comes to Kong and the dinosaurs. Thankfully, we have the benefit of reading the novel with a cinematic image of Kong in mind, because the novel doesn't furnish much for the imagination to work with. Lovelace only gives vaguely simian descriptions at best. The order of events is more or less the same as the film. When the sailors work their way up a side canyon in the cliff that faces the wall, they first encounter the Stegosaurus, and then the Brontosaurus. But after that, we get an entire thrilling episode missing from the film that, in turn, explains the later scene on the log above the infamous spider pit. As Kong spirits Anne away to Skull Mountain, he encounters a group of Triceratops, trapped in a tar pit. It's an interesting deviation from an observation that I had made a few times in a few videos, that King Kong is a very New York kind of story. Beginning and ending there, and in between, featuring a prehistoric island that was basically the American Museum of Natural History come to life. The islands of Manhattan and Skull Island are strongly paralleled. But, in this novelization, we see the snippet of something taken from Los Angeles, namely, the La Brea Tar Pits, a world-famous paleontological site in which we find the bones of Ice Age Pleistocene fauna trapped for 40,000 years in seeps of natural asphalt. Of 3 Triceratopses, 1 gets stuck in the asphalt. The other 2 find more solid ground and continue to amble along their way until Kong picks up hardened slabs of the asphalt and hurls them at the Triceratopses. One of the slabs breaks off one of the dinosaur's horns, and a second slab kills it. The survivor lurches away, until another slab catches its attention. Unfortunately, the first thing it sees is the band of sailors, who survived the attack in the Brontosaur swamp, inching their way toward the log spanning the ravine. It gives chase, trapping the men on the log. That, in turn, draws Kong's attention. The scene unfolds as we know it from the film, with a couple of alterations. First, this chain of events was streamlined for the film. Second, the Triceratops was replaced with a Styracosaurus that traps the crew on the log. But, to be fair, the Triceratops themselves were a change. As originally conceived, the scene was to use the Arsenotherium model left over from Willis O'Brien's Creation project. But it was changed to Triceratops, since he had those lying around from Creation as well. Then, to the admittedly more dramatic Styracosaurus, finally, the entire sequence was removed, and the crew are chased directly from the Brontosaurus swamp to the log, where they are paralyzed with fear and unable to backtrack off the safe side of the ravine. The novelization also includes our only detailed look at the missing spider pit sequence, filled with lizards, spiders, and something described as an octopus insect, a round, crawling object with tentacles like those of an octopus. The men who don't die in the fall get mired in the mud, where they were immediately set upon by the slithering creatures of the pit. Rather than a weird 2-legged reptile crawling up to him, Jack must fight off a giant spider crawling up a vine towards his hiding place. The fight with the meat-eater is more or less the same, but we get a point of characterization missing from the film, in which Anne actively roots for Kong to win. She wanted Kong to win, Lovelace writes. She had no thought that she could survive much longer the horror of captivity in his hands, but even that was preferable to the open mouth which briefly swung her way. After Jack rescues Anne, the novel's pace slows down considerably. Much more time is taken watching the two make their way back to the village, expanding their love story, which is fine for a novel that doesn't bog itself down in visual description, but not so good for a film that wants to move along at a breakneck pace to keep the excitement high. According to The Making of King Kong by Orville Goldner, who was himself a technician in Willis O'Brien's miniature workshop, this scene of them drifting down the river back to the village was filmed, but like many, ended up on the cutting room floor to tighten the film. Alternately, when they make it back to the village and Kong attacks, there is much less description. Action scenes are of less interest to Lovelace than character moments are, which is fair enough. Action is harder to write than it is to film, and character moments are easier to make interesting in print than on celluloid. It's just the difference between literary and cinematic media. So after a short explanation of how they plan on transporting Kong, we get back to New York, and Kong is being displayed in a cage. But he breaks free, as he's wont to do, and goes on a rampage. And Kong is able to track down Anne so quickly because the crew of the Wanderer is staying at a hotel across the street from the theater. This point goes unmentioned in the film. One can infer that it's a hotel where they are staying, but they never explain it, and the film feels like Kong just finds her by accident. In the film, the one person I feel most sorry for is the lady who is just sleeping soundly in bed when Kong rips her out of the window, looks her over, and then just tosses her when he determines that she's not Anne. That isn't in the novel, but we get an equally horrific scene in Driscoll's bright idea to cheer up Anne by eavesdropping on their neighbor's telephone call. The lady is talking with her beau Jimmy, when suddenly she breaks into screams. Then, as Jack rushes out to help, Kong's hand breaks in through his window and grabs Anne. Now, the original scene with the lady on the telephone was filmed, but it was reshot with the lady in the bed. As they pursue Kong, he mostly stays out of the way by taking to the rooftops. There is far less destruction in this version, perhaps attributable to Lovelace's general difficulty with action scenes. But finally, we reach the top of the Empire State Building and Kong's final stand. In this version, we see and hear more of Kong slowly succumbing to the bullets of the passing biplanes. As his life ebbs and his grip fails, Kong makes one last-ditch effort and leaps out at one of the planes, clearing the lower ramparts of the Empire State Building and falling straight to the ground. Again, it's a fascinating alternate version of King Kong, where things are just a little bit different. Overall, the novel does nicely scratch an itch to see more of Kong's world and spend more time in it. This is why, even though I don't like the 2005 version for many reasons, I can sympathize with Peter Jackson's desire to spend more time in Kong's world, to elaborate it, to explore it. The 1933 film is a glorious hour and 45 minutes, and you just don't want it to end. You want to reach into the screen and explore the island, know the characters, watch the tribal ceremonies, drink a Mai Tai on the beach, and be there in the midst of the excitement on Broadway. But it becomes surprisingly interminable when you spend 3 hours sitting in a movie theater. The novel, which by its very nature as a novel, slows you down and gives you the chance to spend that extra time in that world, with those extra scenes missing from the film. The spider pit sequence works just as good here as its absence works in the film. It's also an important book to know and to stow away a copy of, because of its copyright status. Because the copyright was never renewed, the 1932 novelization is the only part of the King Kong story that is presently in the public domain. I've covered the legal issues around Kong in other videos, so I won't belabor it here. The short of it is that the 1933 film and its original elements belong to RKO and will continue to until 2029, with the distribution rights held by Warner Brothers, who own the Monsterverse in tandem with Legendary. The English dubs of the Toho films and the 2005 version, and various ancillary theme park rights and things, belong to Universal. The 1976 version and its sequel belong to Studio Canal, which bought out Dino De Laurentiis. But the book is public domain. The Merian C. Cooper estate has been working with Joe DeVito to rewrite a copyrightable version of the novelization, on which they base the King Kong of Skull Island franchise that has been supplemented with his own books and licensed by Mezco, Raw Thrills VR arcade games, and now Disney for production into a show on streaming. And is pretty safe, in the minefield of Kong copyright, for people to license the use of Kong from one or another rights holder. I mean, I don't blame Disney for crossing their T's and dotting their I's. But in theory, anyone can produce a King Kong work that is derivative of the 1932 novelization. Warner did that with the 1998 Mighty Kong cartoon, BKN with the Kong the Animated Series and its spin-off movies in the early 2000s, Netflix Kong King of the Apes series, and the abrasive King Kong Alive on Broadway production that wrapped in 2019. But I don't really have to make a pitch for the novel to fans of Kong. I mean, heck, you probably already own a copy of the book. I wouldn't call the novel overly well written. I mean, it's not bad, but it's not great literature. It gets the job done. For me, the real interest lies in the light it sheds on the creative process behind the making of the film, and for the extra scenes that flesh out what did eventually get put on screen.